For me, I think the most important part of an opening, or at least what hooks me, is intrigue. Just enough. I think you need a foundation, enough to sort of give us a foundation of the characters, maybe a little tease of the world. And then I just use the word teaser or tease. And so I think that's also really important. So you're giving the reader a foundation, but also a teaser of what's to come.
What is up, everybody? You're listening to episode 42 of SFF Addicts. I'm your host, Adrian M. Gibson, and welcome to your weekly dive into the world of science fiction, fantasy, and writing craft. Joining me, as always, is my co-host, the Chewie to my Han Solo, the Joker to my Commander Shepard, my dear MJ Kuhn. How are you?
Hello, I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm fantastic, thank you. And just a word for listeners, the official SFF Addicts Patreon and merch store are now live, so check the links in the description to support what we do here. You can get access to patron-exclusive bonus episodes, author readings, and more. And you can purchase t-shirts, mugs, notebooks, and all kinds of cool swag. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the FanFiAddict YouTube channel, where this and every other episode of the show is available in full video. And don't forget to rate and review the podcast on your favorite podcast app. And now, joining us once again from the future is none other than Chelsea Abdullah, author of The Stardust Thief. So welcome back, Chelsea.
Hi, good to be back.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. And a heads up, this is part 2 of our 2-part chat with Chelsea, so I recommend checking out part 1 to get to know her a little bit better. Today, we'll be diving into a mini masterclass on writing beginnings. So just to launch right into this mini masterclass, in your opinion, what makes a great novel opener and why are beginnings so important?
So for me, I think the most important part of an opening, or at least what hooks me, is intrigue. Just enough. I think you need a foundation, enough to sort of give us a foundation of the characters, maybe a little tease of the world. And then I just use the word teaser or tease. And so I think that's also really important. So you're giving the reader a foundation, but also a teaser of what's to come. And I think that's why the word intrigue is so important to me and why I always go back to that word. There's, this sort of idea of, an opening that will compel you to read on, I think is the most effective opening. It's what everyone, it's what we as writers aim for. Here's sort of a sneak peek of the story. Here's what's to come. You need to read to find out more.
Mm-hmm.
So
I love that word intrigue because it's like, for me, one of the best things about books is just, it is like the imagination of the author and the intrigue that they use to pique your curiosity. And for me, it's like that combination of imagination and curiosity is so good because it's like, I'm going to hook you and you're going to keep reading.
Well, especially in science fiction fantasy, in this genre, like if you can show readers from the very beginning, sort of this goes into world building. But if you can show them that spark of imagination, that thing that makes the world or the characters different, then that will factor into that hook that will bring readers in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, you said obviously the intrigue and that it has to have like a foundation, set the stage. But it's funny that you bring in both world building and characters, because I was just going to ask you, in your opinion, or your process, which do you think is more important in pulling a reader in, or which do you tend to focus on when you're writing?
So I am both a character-driven writer and reader. So personally, that's always going to be what resonates the most with me. If I and I think, I think like you can build in a really interesting world in an opening, and I think some readers prefer that. But usually for me, what's going to get me to read more is interest in the characters, because we're following the protagonist around. So like if you can get me to care about that protagonist, or at least be excited to learn more about that protagonist, then that's going to make me continue to read the story. And for me, as someone who is a character-driven writer, the setting and the world building kind of unfolds from the character. So the character is kind of my anchor point. And then you learn about the world through the character's eyes, which is another reason I think that, if you can ground us in that character and in your opening, then that will also help with your world building as well.
Agreed. Because it's like the character, like you said, seeing it through their eyes is what grounds you in them, but then what they see grounds you in the world. And that's enough to establish you don't need everything at once. And I was talking to someone recently about the tendency for a lot of fantasy and sci-fi, especially older fantasy and sci-fi, to just dump
Info dump.
so much exposition on the readers at the very beginning. It's just like, hey, you want to get into this book? Let me just run you through like 1,000 years of history.
Oh, right.
Buckle the fuck up. Let's have fun. And I'm like, I don't know any, like the names is just too much. There's too many locations. There's too many dates, blah, blah, blah. It's like
meeting your boyfriend's family for the first time and you get introduced to 20 people at once and you don't remember any of their names.
It all goes through one year, not the other.
MJ, my wife, her parents, each of them has like 7 or 8 siblings. So for me, it was like, well,
you were like, you guys have some sort of directory I could follow.
Yeah, give me like the hotel directory for all of this family of like who's who. But I like that because it's so much more
accessible.
It's so much more accessible for readers to jump into a world and be able to latch onto something like much more tangible and solid as a character, a POV character, and to be like, I'm going to be inside your head and feel what you're feeling and see what you see, and the world is just going to unravel slowly through your eyes. And I think that's way more interesting than just like, like here's like a list of corporations that work in the sci-fi. I don't give any shit about that.
I mean, maybe it's for some readers, but it's definitely not for me.
It's not for me either.
Probably out there are some readers. I think so. I think I saw something on Twitter about someone who's just like bashing character-driven stories, and I'm like, well, have fun.
No book is right for every reader, right?
Exactly.
It's true.
Exactly.
It's true. And I mean, I was going to say, some writers do start off their stories with like glossaries and things like that. I know most of the time they're at the end of the book, but for anyone who's curious, I guess to jump into that immediately, then that content's there.
Just go straight to the glossary. That's my job. Yeah.
You want the world building, it's there, right?
Live your dreams.
We've been talking about readers quite a bit so far, but this one is specifically for writers and what they have to do in order to make their stories stand out to agents and editors. So why do you think story beginnings are so vital when it comes to what a writer will eventually pitch to an agent or sometimes an editor, or what an agent might end up pitching to an editor?
So I think, at a practical level, unfortunately, agents will usually be reading those openings and basing their decision to read more on those on your opening. When I was in the query trenches, I had agents who would, their requirements would vary from 25 pages to 5. I think, there was one submission package that was 5. And I felt like, especially validated when I got a request based on 5 pages. I'm like, hey, that means my opening's good, right? So, and I think even, as a writer, like if you're trying to draw a readership, if you're trying to draw someone into your book, trying to get readers' attention, especially like, nowadays, attention spans are a lot more fleeting. There's a lot more distractions. So I feel
TikTok MJ. As if you're like the creator of TikTok. No.
Right? I made it. I'm a millionaire.
Sorry, Chelsea.
The more you know. I had no idea, MJ. But yeah, so I'd say openings are vital for that reason. You're trying to get your reader into the story as quickly as possible, especially if you're a debut writer and people aren't familiar with your writing. They're not comeback readers who are coming to you because they know your style, they love your style. you're trying to introduce a reader to your writing for the first time. And, I think this applies for, books that are not debut novels as well. But like, especially when you're in the query trenches, especially when you're trying to get an agent, when you're trying to get editor interest, the stronger and more compelling you can make your opening, the better. Although, like you both said, you also don't want to like throw too much into your opening to the point where you're overwhelming everyone, which is why I always go back to intrigue. It's like if you can just create enough of a hook, to have that agent get excited about your world and excited about your character, then I think you're crafting a good opening.
This is just one I want to toss out to the both of you, just out of curiosity. But this is something that I've noticed where a lot of writers who are much more famous and they don't really have to deal with the trenches and the bullshit of, seeking agents. And it's like agents and editors are seeking them.
Yeah.
I feel like sometimes like a bit of laziness seeps in where it's like they're just like they're way more prone to just dump purple prose and not really trying as hard to get that hook, because it's like, you see my name, you're gonna buy this book. So I'm just gonna start this book the way that I want to, and I don't really care.
I almost feel like, so it's like what people say about rules, like you need to know the rules before you can bend them. Yeah. And I think if you have a readership and you have some experience under your belt and you have people who are going to come back to your book, come back to your work because they like your work, then I feel like there's more flexibility. And at least, like, I'm speaking as someone who's just making assumptions because I am still a newbie author. But I think that's the impression I get, is, the more you understand the rules, the more you play by the rules, at least initially, although, everyone's experiences are different, the more you can kind of play with them later.
MJ, what do you think about this? This is just like me just vomiting off the top of my head.
Well, I am one of those really famous people that
read Thick as Thieves. I'm just like, I don't give a shit what you think. Yeah.
Yeah, you'll like it. No, I do think that that's like probably a risk that anyone could fall into. Just if you don't have, I think the more successful you get, maybe the more likely it is that you're able to get through some of those gates without the pushback. It's a dumb comparison, but like it makes me think of like all those people. You ever watch American Idol back in like the early 2000s? All those people at like the original audition day that were like just quite tone deaf, and it's like, oh honey, if someone had just told you, you wouldn't have, you could have gone a vocal coach and like done the things, right? So it's like, I feel like you get to a point where you're not hearing the feedback that might help you to craft it into something that's the strongest that it could be. But again, I am also just pulling thoughts out of my ass here because I am definitely not anywhere remotely close to anything resembling that.
Just wait for Thick as Thieves, people. Come on.
There you go.
You're absolutely a celebrity in my eyes.
100%.
Also, MJ, I appreciate you dropped American Idol and Chelsea in the last episode dropped Survivor. We're just going to some early 2000s reality show hits today.
Why American Idol popped into my head. Chelsea, you put me back in my parents' living room when you said Survivor.
I mean, you talked to me about my childhood. Those shows are absolutely going to be on my radar.
Like the Millennial Foundations, people.
Yeah. Love it.
Oh my God. All right. So getting back into
serious
writing,
business,
right? So we talked a lot about your writing process in part one of our interview together. So listeners, if you haven't checked that out, go check it out because it's great. It's fascinating. But for writing beginnings specifically, are you a chronological writer? Do you always start writing the beginning, or do you kind of bounce around a lot? Have you found that it's more your style to come back and write the beginning later? Like, what's your process look like?
So because I am a pantser, I need a foundation when I start. Yeah. Otherwise I'm, if I don't have an opening, then what do I have? Nothing, because that's my anchor point. That's where I start. So for me, openings are very, very clear in my head. I talk to a lot of people who say that they go back, they edit their openings, and I definitely edit my openings. Um, but usually, the place that opening is taking place, and sort of like the general character dynamics, the general plot line of the opening stays the same. So and I've only published one book, so I don't know how my openings will or won't change in the future for other books. But for the Stardust Thief, I definitely edited that opening and I expanded on it in a later draft. But it has always been the same. It's always started with a merchant on a ship with her Djinn bodyguard with the same exchange, because that was where I knew the story would begin. It was the only thing that I really had of the story to go off of. So it had to be very solid for me. And so, as a result, openings always are very, very shiny in my head. They're always very exciting. I love openings. I feel the exact opposite way about endings. Endings are way more difficult for me. They take a lot of revising. But openings, for me, I think are actually the most exciting part of the story. I love writing them.
Yeah, it's the best part. I
And
agree.
you mentioned in part one as well, this visual element. Like you had this visual of the merchant and the Djinn bodyguard on a ship and this kind of thing. And I think it's really fascinating, like talking to Hannah as well. She has like a lot of this kind of like visual push to
Yeah.
this kind of creative push. And even the story that I'm writing right now, like it started with it's pretty grotesque, but it started with like a dead body with mushrooms bursting out of them.
Oh,
Like that's the visual that I started
Yeah.
this
that
book
is a
with.
strong visual.
And so I think, you know, that kind of stuff that writers can experience is also really telling about the evocative nature of beginnings for readers as well. Cause it's like
Yeah.
if an author can capture that, the thing that they're seeing in their head or that feeling that they have, a reader's gonna latch on to that and be like, you know, these characters are amazing. Like this tone and the sort of vibe that I get from this is really strong and I want to keep going. Or if they want
Right.
more info dumping, then they just don't read any of our work. It's like, fine, whatever.
Well, and I mean, we're talking about visual imagery and like, I kind of think about a painting, at a museum. Like if you're looking at all these different paintings, and they all kind of start to blur together, but then like maybe there's this one painting that really compels you. And like at the very beginning, when you're looking at it, you're only seeing it in broad strokes, but something compels you to, to move forward and like examine it a little closer. And I feel like that's what an opening is, like you have to create in broad strokes, the sort of atmosphere of your story, the setting, the characters, and then you want the reader to push forward. You're trying to give them a reason to dig deeper into the story. But it's hard, because like you're trying to do something. You're trying to pull all of this weight in this first chapter, and it can be difficult. Like
Yeah.
finding the right opening can be hard to find that. For me, because I stick with my stories for so many years, because I usually tend to like roll them around in my head for a couple of years at least before I start writing them, I can think on that opening. So for me, that's where most of that work happens, is in my head. And
Yeah.
some writers, I think some writers, will start with an opening, but then it doesn't quite feel right to them, and then they have to go back and edit it and rejigger some things, and that's totally fine. But I think it happens at different parts in our process. But we all need to think about it. We all need to think, we all need to juggle all these elements at some point, and then get them down on the page, which can be difficult, but if you get it there, then it's incredibly rewarding.
Definitely. And I want to get your take on prologues, because we've been talking about beginnings, and it's like obviously a lot of books start with chapter one, but a lot of books also start with prologues. the classic fantasy and sci-fi we were talking about earlier, that info dumping usually happened in a prologue.
Yeah.
Because the characters don't show up until chapter 1.
Probably why prologues have such a bad name.
I know, but it's like I think prologues can be really good, but I want to get your take
Yeah.
on prologues in general, and maybe you've written them in some of your past projects before the Stardust Thief, or what your thoughts are from the perspective of a reader as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, technically, the Stardust Thief has a prologue. It's not labeled prologue, so I think a lot of people won't think of it as a prologue, but it is in essence. It starts, with the tale of the Djinn,
Yeah.
which
Mhm.
is, sort of a story in a story, and then it launches into chapter one. And that prologue, I think, is 2 pages. But I remember, going into the query trenches because everyone was like, don't include prologues, cut your prologues. But for me, it felt very important to keep it. So I kept it in there.
Yeah.
I definitely had that mindset of, if it's called The Tale of the Djinn, are they still going to think of it as a prologue?
Just get the
um,
word out there. Just cut it.
Yeah,
Cut it
just
out.
cut that. I mean, seriously, if you
a
just
lot of
label
writers
it
do.
yeah.
I
I
think
think
a lot of writers do.
I think I started my book with just 0. And I was
Yeah,
like,
I love it.
I think
fuck
that's
it.
compelling though. You're like, why is it called zero? What does it mean?
Yeah.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, I know people have really strong opinions about prologues, which makes me a little sad because I do think that you can write a good prologue.
Mhm.
I think prologues, like any other writing tool, can be good or bad in the hands of the writer. It just depends on how the writer uses them. Um, I do think, there's a tendency to info dump in prologues. I think sometimes a prologue can be unnecessary and can be, just chapter one. I personally think, like for me, the prologue that I always think of is the prologue of the Night Circus, which I was thinking about this the other day, and was reminded by my roommate. I was thinking about that first line, which is "the circus comes without warning," which is such a good
Mm.
line, and I
Yeah.
was
Yeah.
like, "Oh, that's such a good, chapter one opening." And she said, "It's not chapter one; it's in the prologue." And so, like, I hadn't even remembered that this book had a prologue. But then I went back and realized, this prologue was very compelling. Um, and I think one thing that Aaron Morgenstern does that's like really incredible with that book, and one thing that I've noted with good prologues, is they kind of set up a framework, like a unique sort of structure to the story.
Mm.
So in the Night Circus, you have these chapters that are in second person, that focus on the reader or whoever coming into the circus. So,
Yeah.
this happens throughout the story. And so that initial prologue is about the circus. And so it's setting up those later sections and the atmosphere of those later sections through the
Mhm.
prologue. And I like to think that the Stardust Thief does the same thing, because I use stories and stories later on. So,
Yes.
for me, I started with the Tale of the Djinn because I wanted that world building before you jumped into the first chapter.
Yeah.
But it's very short. It's, a page and a half. I think that's very important. Like, keep your prologue short.
Mhm.
Because very often people see the word prologue and they're like, I'm going to skip it. So
Yeah.
if it's a short prologue, people are probably going to
Just turn the page and be like, "Oh, okay."
like, that's not that
Yeah.
Take a look
bad.
at it.
Yeah, no, but so, I start with the Tale of the Djinn, but then the Stardust Thief features a lot of stories and stories.
Mhm.
Um, there's the tale of Amir and the Lamp, there's the tale of the Queen of Dunes. And so, like, when that pops up later, I wanted it, my feeling was, oh, I want this to sort of feel like, oh, wait, we got this earlier in the story.
Yeah.
It's
Mhm.
coming back. So, I wanted to set that up. And I wanted to set up that world building, but in a way that didn't feel info dumpy. And because I was using the story and story narrative, it felt natural to me to start the story sort of with this oral storytelling framework, with
Mhm.
someone telling one of the main characters the story of the Djinn, and then you launch into the first chapter, and you see the main character with a Djinn bodyguard, and you have a
Yeah.
little bit of that foundation. It's like, oh, you have that juxtaposition of, oh, this is what the stories say about Djinn, but here's a Djinn character. So
Right.
like, what's going on? So there's a little bit of tension there. So I think, clearly, I think like you can do a prologue really well. But I think you need to, it's best to keep it short. Um, and I think always like ask the question of, does this need to exist? I think a lot of people get really defensive, and like, when I initially, had beta readers on this story, this prologue was way too long, and a lot of people said, "Why don't you cut it?" And I got defensive. I was like, "No, the prologue is very important to me." But I got some really, really fantastic feedback, and I figured out how to narrow it. And once I did that,
yeah,
everyone was suddenly like, "Oh, okay, I see why you need it now."
Yeah.
Not when you had it, not what you had previously that was too long, but this makes sense for your story. So, I think if you're passionate about the prologue, try to find a way to make it work. But don't be afraid to let it go. Like, it's not, it's not a staple of fantasy. You don't need it. If you want to jump right in with the characters, if you don't, need to set up a framework, if you don't, I think prologues can also be done really well through other character POVs. Like I've seen some done through like, in the past, through a character that you might not necessarily get in the narrative until later. You see them in the present tense. And so you have a little bit of background from that past tense. That can be done well. But do you need that POV? Like, do you need that information? Is that something that can be filtered into the story? That's something that I would always ask about a prologue.
Yeah, it's like, is the prologue like a functional framework for what is going to come afterwards, or is it just kind of like fluff?
Yeah.
Unnecessary.
Right. Well, or sometimes it's necessary for you in the writing process to figure out where you want to start, but that doesn't mean it needs to make it into the final cut necessarily. But sometimes it does. So speaking of figuring out where you want to start, I know you mentioned that you kind of mull things over for a long time and kind of let it marinate a little bit, let it figure out. And once you are ready to set pen to paper, you have a pretty clear idea of what you're going to do, where you're going to start. What is the hardest part then about writing a novel opener? Or does it just feel like, sometimes I know when you're really in the zone, it can feel like you're transcribing a movie scene as you're watching it, right? Is that how novel openers go for you always? Or what does that kind of look like?
Yeah. I mean, like, I don't know. I think there's this tendency always, like, when I look at things like after the fact to go, oh, yeah, no, it was awesome. So I'm sure. So I'm sure that there are parts of writing an opening that are difficult for me that I don't quite internalize because they tend to run very smoothly for me. I will say, like, especially thinking of the second book, and this is kind of unique to the second book, thinking about how much I need to recap from the first book, like how, yeah, right. Like you need to call back to what was happening, but also you don't want to bombard the reader.
Spoilers.
What if they just finished the first book? So like that has been like a specific struggle with book 2. But I'd say pacing. Very often I'll have like the idea of what I want to write, like everything will be there. But I'm a pantser and an extreme overwriter. So my openings are also very long. So when I've gone and I've looked at my first draft of the Stardust Thief versus, the finished product, or the finished book. I don't want to call it a product. But yeah, the one that's on shelves.
Go listen to part 1 to hear more about products.
I don't think my book is a product. It makes me feel weird. But so one thing that I immediately noticed, the first lines are pretty much the same. Those paragraphs, the first 3-4, I think are relatively unchanged with like some minor copy edits to, kind of streamline the language a little bit. But then a lot of, there are like a lot of additional paragraphs in which the characters are doing totally unnecessary things on the ship. Because the way, the way my opening is right now, it starts with, the main character, Luli, and her bodyguard, Kadir. And they're both, standing on the ship together. They have a brief conversation. they go below decks. They speak with a merchant. There's an exchange there, and then the chapter goes on. In the initial draft, like Luli is describing the layout of the ship. A lot of that is because I needed to know the layout of the ship. So, the character is explaining the world almost to me, the writer, so there's a lot of descriptions. There's, a little more banter, a little more back and forth. So things went a little slower for me. And then when I went back for edits, I just kind of chopped it down, made it more concise. The reader doesn't need to know about every single room on this ship. The reader doesn't need to hear this like very random history anecdote between the two characters that can come later. So I think that's probably my struggle. But I honestly really love editing for that because I love openings so much. I know I feel like I'm gushing about them so much.
No, because they're so fun. I'm with you.
Fun. And I love editing them. I think too, because like there's so much more enjoyable to edit than the saggy middle of the story. So I will go and revise my openings multiple times until they're like, so shiny, so polished. I feel so good about them. And then my beta readers will read past that point to like chapter 7 or something. I'm like, oh, I'm so sorry for everything that happens past this point. This is an early draft.
You've hit the wall.
you've hit the first draft wall. The opening is super, super polished. Yeah, I love it. Chef's kiss. Everything else is terrible. I'm so sorry.
So relatable though.
Yeah. I appreciate you using plural though, because it's like you say openings and them, because it's like, the Stardust Thief has multiple POVs, and this is something that MJ and I have been curious about because she also wrote Among Thieves in multiple POVs. Was it hard to decide which POV to open with, and what are your thoughts on kind of doing this multi-POV approach, but also giving each character like a distinct beginning and a really good opening line? We haven't talked about opening lines, but I think it's like opening line.
Yeah.
I think is sometimes a bit overrated in terms of its importance, but it's like there's some really fucking good opening lines sometimes.
Right? Yeah. Well, first of all, shout out to MJ who wrote really fantastic openings for all of her POVs. Yeah. Go read her book. That's it. It's always my favorite thing to like read compelling openings for various characters because obviously I'm an opening person. So when I get multiple openings, I'm like, oh, here we go. Like I'm stirred. Yeah, it is like a little present. So yeah, I spoke a little bit about this in the first bit. But when I started out the Stardust Thief, it was originally a one POV story. And then I literally got into chapter 2 and said, but what if it was more? So I didn't last very long. Yeah. At this point, I have fully acknowledged that I probably will never write like a single POV. I'm, too much of an antsy writer. Like I like,
multi-POV is just too fun.
It's too fun. Yeah. And I mean, I like what it does for the world building too. You get to see the world through like very different perspectives. So initially it started out with just Luli. I didn't have plans to do, other POVs until they literally appeared on the page. And I was like, oh, this is fun. That being said, so I really like parallels. So one thing that I did with mine, the first chapter and the second chapter, so Luli and Mazen, they kind of both have parallel lines. I think Luli's is when Luli al-Nazari was told by the one-eyed merchant to meet on a small and humble dhow, she expected quite reasonably a small and humble dhow. And then Mazen's, oh gosh, of course I don't remember his as well. But his is something along the lines of like when Mazen bin Malik was told by his servant that his older brother would be returning the first hour of sunset. He, was in fact expecting his brother to return the first hour of sunset. So something like that. But so I like to do those two parallel lines. One reason that I love to do this and one reason I love to see this as a reader is because I feel like one, it's fun. Like you're kind of playing around with language. But you're playing around with language and like showing a lot about the character with like, a similar framework, but also establishing right off the bat that they are completely different people.
Yes. Exactly.
You know, one of them is, you know, Luli is like this mysterious merchant who's been called by this, you know, by this client to deliver this magic. And Mazen is sneaking out the the window of his bedroom because he thinks his brother isn't home.
Right.
You know, so so two very, very different kinds of openings. But you know, having that first line kind of establishes, you know, this is the same story. You know, this is sort of the atmosphere that I'm going for. But like, here's I'm playing with the line to show you how different the characters are. So that's something that I really like. I really love to play with, like, you know, echoes. I love to have like reoccurring lines, especially in openings, because they are like the first time you see a character. So, you know, I had Luli, I had Mazen when I first started out the Stardust Thief. I had other POVs that I, you know, unfortunately did not make the cut for the final book, but it's fine. You know, they helped the story get to where it needed to be. And then there's a third POV character, Aisha. Her opening was really interesting because in the first draft, her POV did not appear until like midway through the book. So, you know, and she was, again, unexpected, as most things in my draft are.
Just spicing up the saggy middle.
And the thing is, like, she existed as a character, but I couldn't get into her head until, like, you know, the midway point. And it wasn't actually, you know, I queried with her still being a middle POV. And then my agent, you know, the agent that I decided to go with, Jennifer Azanchian, she, you know, she took one look at the Aisha POV and she was like, have you considered bringing her in earlier? She's a very compelling and important character.
Fantastic.
And that was kind of how I knew, you know, Jen was the agent for me. She was like, more Aisha. So Aisha's opening actually came to me later. In a way more polished draft. You know, I had to go back and, you know, I was dissecting a lot of parts of the story. I was taking out a POV. So I added her in a lot earlier. You know, I kind of had to reweave things. But even when I started her POV, I think her first line came to me pretty quickly. Of course I can't remember it off the top of my head. But I love strong opening lines. I think because I work so much with snapshots, with, like, you know, very with these like images, these out of context images of these characters. So, you know, that's what I start with. And because that image is so compelling to me and that image is in my opening, you know, in Aisha's case, like, it was a little belated because I already know who she was as a character. But still, I had to go back in time. And when I was thinking, like, oh, when does it make sense for her to appear in the story? I had that image in my head. I'm like, okay, no, this makes sense. She's going to come in. I think it's like chapter 7 or something like that in the book right now. So it's not 3 different POV characters right off the bat. But I like to think that it feels natural for the flow of the book. So, yeah.
Totally. Awesome. All right. So to finish off this mini masterclass, I know you already talked about the Night Circus as an example of a prologue specifically, but do you have any other novels that have just like super kick-ass openings?
She prepared.
Yeah, I am prepared. Yeah, no, so one of my favorite books, just make sure that I have the correct opening line. So the first line of A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab has stuck with me for so many years. It's just Kel wore a very peculiar coat. And it's such a simple line, but it does there's so many questions that arise because of that line. Like, what do you mean a peculiar coat? You know, and then it goes on to say, it had neither one side, which would be conventional, nor two, which would be unexpected, but several, which was, of course, impossible. And so you're like, what does that mean? You know, and so like every step, every like line in this opening, there's that element of intrigue of like, oh, what is the magic in this world? How is this peculiar coat existing? Who is this character that would wear a peculiar coat? What's in the coat? You know, like all of these questions arising just because of that one line. And I do agree that, like, you said this earlier. I think there's a lot of pressure for the first lines to be the best lines, and I don't think they need to be. Um, but that being said, a line like that has really stuck with me. Like, I've always remembered that it was about a coat. That's where the story started, with this very specific element. And I think that gets to what I was saying earlier about character. Like, I mean, the nights. It's interesting because the night circus actually starts with like the circus. But
Yeah.
one thing that Erin Morgenstern does is she kind of makes the circus into a character all on
Yeah.
its own, because
Yeah.
as you're going through the story, like, the circus is evolving. So the circus feels as intimate as a character. And in V. Schwab's opening, it's very hyper focused. We're looking at a coat that this one character is wearing. But that is immediately more compelling to me than getting like a zoomed out view of the world. And
Mhm.
like, I definitely think you can, there are so many incredible authors who do a more like zoomed out approach, who, show us more of the setting, more of the world, and do it in this way that's, really exciting. But for me, at least, like, these are the lines that really stick out to me. The ones that are, very character focused, that make me immediately ask questions about the character. And then, as a result, their world.
Mhm. Yeah, but what you mentioned about the authors that are able to do this, where it's like a bit more of an expansive opening line. I just remember always one of the ones that has always stuck with me is William Gibson's Neuromancer,
Mm.
which for me is so much about mood, even though it's a really complicated novel just because of the way it plays with language. But the mood is so strong, and the way that that book opens up, it's just the sky above the port was the color of television tuned to a
Mm.
dead channel, and that is like fucking mood, so
Yeah.
strong,
And
and that
that's
is
such a strong image, though, like,
Well, and
such
it
a
yeah,
creates that
powerful visual.
intrigue
yeah,
that Chelsea's talking about,
yeah,
right? Where it's like,
yeah,
what does that mean? Like, I can see
exactly.
it, but okay, like, where is this port? What's going on? But yeah,
Yeah.
yep,
But just like that visual metaphor is so strong that's like, okay, there's no character yet, but you got
Yeah.
me. You
But,
got me. So
it
it's like
feels like it's so broad, but it also feels so specific because,
exactly.
like, it's the sky, but also it's the very specific quality of the sky.
Hmm.
So, like, it still feels very grounding, which is, I mean, it's an incredible balance.
Yeah.
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 Shout out to William Gibson, fellow Canadian.
There's fellow Gibson.
Yeah, fellow Gibson. All right. Well, we will wrap things up there. That's it for our two-parter with Chelsea, and we're really, really appreciative that you came in and took the time to chat with us about this. Thank you for imparting your wisdom about beginnings and opening lines and all that good stuff. And hopefully, it will serve as a benefit for writers out there, unpublished or published, indie or trad, who can take away something very, very useful about beginnings. As well, for anyone who contributes to the Patreon at $10 or more a month, you can get a reading from Chelsea of The Stardust Thief. So go check that out. And Chelsea, if you can let everyone know where they can find you on social media.
Yeah. So you can find me on both Twitter and Instagram at Chelsea Abdullah, CHELSABDULLAH. And I also have a site if you want to reach out to me. It's literally just my name, chelseaabdullah.com.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And you can also follow SFF Addicts on Twitter or Instagram at sffaddictspod. And you can follow me at Adrian M. Gibson. And MJ, where can folks find you?
Across all socials, you can find me at MJ Kuhn Books.
Wonderful. Now, keep reading, keep imagining, and we'll see you next time on SFF Addicts.